Awesome. Okay, good morning, everybody. It's afternoon here, but I'm happy to see all the West Coasters. Thank you for coming out today. I really appreciate it. Um, I'm going to go straight to the share screen because why not? How do I do that? There. Here we go. Tips and tricks for the 2024 card. Everybody seeing that? Okay. As Doris was just saying, this is my number one adage that luck favors the prepared mind. And what I mean by that, for those of you who've never heard me speak before, my whole philosophy is the better you know, the better prepared you are, the more you'll be able to take advantage of luck when it comes your way. For instance, when a joker comes, when a flower comes, you will know what to do with it if you understand the card and understand your options. I've seen people with six or seven jokers. Granted, they didn't start with them, but they somehow during the game amassed six or seven jokers, and they still weren't able to win. They didn't really think about what they'd be able to do with it, so they weren't prepared as well as some of us who really study the card and think about it and pre-plan. So my whole philosophy, especially when the new card comes out, is I want to teach you as best I can so that you can master. I'm not saying memorize the card. I'm just saying know the card. I want you to feel comfortable with every section of the card and every different option on the card so that you are able, when the lucky tiles come your way, to know what to do with them. Um, this card, I'm just going to give you a real quick opinion about this card. I think that some of you have already been playing with it quite a bit. I love this new card. I'm really pleased that the league has sort of stepped up their game. They're a little more creative this year. There's some new ideas. They've brought back a couple of old ideas, but I just really think this is a better card than usual. It's fun to switch hands. Um, it's got some creative new ideas that I'm going to talk about with you today and hopefully give you some ideas of what you should be doing to up your game. Granted, if you are there with the rest of your normal group today, you're all going to learn at the same rate. But if you're like my people that are online right now from remote locations, when you go back to your regular game, you're going to blow their minds. They're going to be like, how did she get so much better? And you'll say, oh, I don't know. But the more you prepare, the more you listen and pay attention to the patterns on the card or the options that you have, the better you're going to do because you're going to be prepared for good opportunities when they come to you. Okay, so uh, this is kind of a weird card in that the only quints this year are just flowers and numbers. There's no quints of winds. There's no quints of dragons. Keep that in the back of your mind when you're trying to remember things about hands this year. Remember, there are never quints of dragons or winds. So that's important to know. The fact that there are quints of flowers, there are some years where there aren't. So it's very interesting to remember there are quint hands with flowers, not just in the quint section. So keep an eye out for that as well. Okay. Um, the other things that are different about this card, there are pairs of flowers. There are kongs of flowers. A kong is four of a kind. There are quints of flowers, but there are no pungs of flowers this year. That means no three of a kind. Um, just about everything else has pungs and kongs. There are pungs and kongs of dragons, numbers, and winds all over the card. The only thing with no three of a kind is the flower. Remember that. It's really important when we're building hands. Just keep that in mind. The only thing there's no three of a kind is flowers. Um, there are pairs of every single kind of tile except for east and west. That's another thing to keep in mind when you're trying to keep hands straight. You can say, well, I know that there's a hand that's only got six total winds in it. What are they? Well, there's no pairs of east and west, so there's pairs of north south, but it's only a single east and west. So again, remember, no pungs of flowers, no pairs of east or west. And there are pungs of dragons and there are kongs of dragons. Three of a kind or four of a kind of dragons appear all over the card, but there's only one place on the entire card where there's a dragon pair. And in fact, you'll never see them until Mahjong because they're part of a singles and pairs hand. And you wouldn't expose pairs anyway. But the point being, the only time that there's a pair of dragons is in the singles and pairs section. And that's actually going to be useful when you're thinking about that like numbers hand. We'll get to it in a second, but just in the back of your mind, those of you that know that there is a like numbers hand that involves numbers and dragons, remember, no pairs of dragons anywhere but singles and pairs. Therefore, it's a pung for each of those dragons. So these are kind of things I want you to keep in the back of your mind, making it easier for you to remember how a hand is comprised so that you are not constantly looking at your card. The whole goal of preparing yourself is that you're looking at your tiles and you're looking at the discards, but you're not spending the whole time staring at your card. It'll just make your mind more prepared by thinking about things in advance. You won't be spending your whole time staring and looking. You'll be able to pay attention to what's going on at the table. Okay. As any of you who've read my books or have seen previous lectures know, I always like to talk about the main patterns on a new card. And I usually start with the top hand in the consecutive run section. That's a very important hand for setting the style for the card. This year, it's a very weird hand. We'll get to it in a moment. But the other patterns that are on the card this year, as usual, there are a bunch of hands that don't require any pairs. They're usually pungs and kongs, 3 of a kind, 4 of a kind. And every year they're set up a little differently. This particular year, it's mostly pung pung, kong kong, like 3 of a kind, 3 of a kind, 4 of a kind, 4 of a kind. However, there are a few that aren't quite like that. But just in general, like when you're doing a consecutive run or when you're doing the odd section or the even section, that pung kong hand is going to be pung pung kong kong this year. Another familiar hand that we get every year is a pair, usually a pair of flowers, but sometimes not, but 1 pair and then 3 kongs. So that's the standard hand. We've seen that kind of format before. Some of you have heard me talk about the stairs hand. Those are the ones where it's pair, pair, 2, 2, then pung pung, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4. So it sort of climbs up a stair. 2, 2, 3, 3, 4. Another one I call the bell curve, where it's the highest in the middle. So it's pairs on the ends, gradually increases to pungs, culminates in the middle with a kong. So that's 2, 3, 4, 3, 2. And those two, the stairs and the bell curve, are what we usually see for our consecutive run hand. I hope all of you have got the new card. It's kind of hard to understand what I'm talking about without it, but you are all pretty well familiar now that this year is a little different. We'll get to that in just a moment. One final combination that's very prevalent on this year's card is a pair with 4 pungs, 4 different 3 of a kind. And on this particular card, they are mostly in the concealed part of each section. They are hands that are pretty easy to make because it's all 3 of a kind, 3 of a kind. But because it's concealed, you can't call for those. You can't call until the final mahjong tile, and that's why they're simple hands, except they're not because you can't call for any exposures till the end. That makes it a little tricky. I have a student who told me that she loved this mnemonic or just this reminder about 14. Some of us forget when we're trying to remember what's in that hand, that every hand involves 14 tiles. The pung pung kong kong is 3 plus 3 plus 4 plus 4. A pair and 3 kongs, 2 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4. No matter how you slice it, it always ends up being 14. So when you're having trouble remembering, just remember it always must add up to 14. Okay, so I'm talking about those are the patterns that we've seen before, but what is different this year? One nice thing about this card is, especially for the math nerds among us, I mean, Doris just blew me out of, blew my cover by explaining that for baseball, I was the statistician. I'm definitely a numbers nerd. So the fact that there are multiplication and addition hands appeals to a numbers geek like me. Most of you, if you like mahjong, must like numbers. I'm assuming you enjoy numbers. So because this card has both multiplication and addition hands, that's pretty fun. As you know, the multiplication hands are kind of hidden. We'll get to that. There are like number hands in all different places all over the card. You got to be a little creative. You got to remember that it's not just limited to one section, but it's always good to start if you have no other ideas of what to do. Collecting like numbers can be a really good start, especially during the Charleston, because it shows up in all different ways. So keep in mind, like numbers could be anywhere in the card. You may think that you're playing it in the like number section. You may end up switching it to a totally different section, but just start by amassing those like numbers and you'll have a lot of different options all over the card. The quints this year, I love it. They got a little more specific. I used to enjoy just collecting a little bit of everything and making that into a quint hand. This year, you have to pay attention to the instructions. There's some rules about that they can't be the same suit. There are rules about they can't be the same number. So pay very close attention when you're thinking about what you're doing for quint. Then we get to the one that everybody's been talking about, this bizarre new pattern. We'll talk about it in more detail, but the hand that I usually look at, as I said, the first hand in the consecutive run section, usually either stairs or a bell curve. This year, I'm going to get back to it, but I'm calling it the pinata. I mean, the sombrero. I'm so sorry. I call it the sombrero, and it's pretty cool. We'll get to it. Want to talk about for CR6, which is a really unique hand. First time that I can recall that we have a very specific chow. Um, a chow is something in Chinese and other Asian mahjong where it's three numbers in a row. It's like in Jin Rummy where you do a little run of 4, 5, 6 in diamonds, or you know what I'm saying. It's three numbers in a row, but it is not a pung. You cannot use jokers. You cannot call it for exposure, only for your final mahjong tile. So the chow is sort of just a fun little flourish, but remember they are all singles. So that's the way to remember that is, yeah, they go together, but they are not considered, they are not, they are all, they must be considered singles. Okay. There is a modified Wind's Dragon hand from the hand that we had last year. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then there's two singles and pairs hands that I've never seen before and I really like. I like what they did with the consecutive run singles and pairs hand, singles and pairs number 5. And I'll talk about that in more detail because I think it's a really versatile, neat hand. And then there's the the big hand this year, which I personally think is easier than usual. And I think you're going to, if you play for money, you're going to see people getting that at least once a month. It's really not as hard to make as it usually would be to make the big hand because we're only using 2 soaps. I'll get to it later, but I really feel it's an easier big hand than usual. We'll get to talk about that soon. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to those multiplication hands. Remember, they are not specifically in a section designated for multiplication hands per se. They are hidden in the even and odd section. And there's only very specific uses. You cannot use any other number. They must multiply to either 24 or 48 in the even section or 15 or 35 in the odd section. You can't make up your own kind of multiplication hand. It must be those particular combinations. The product, the 15, the 35, the 24, the 48, those are all singles. You cannot call for them as a meld. Well, they'd be a pair, but even so, you can't call for them until the final mahjong. And if you notice, in both formats, the product is the third suit. So you have the factors 5 and 7, 3 and 5, whatever it is, those must be of 2 different suits. So it's pretty neat. If you're collecting a bunch of different odd numbers, but not enough of anything in any one suit, look at it again and think about whether you might be able to turn it into, if it's odds, you might be able to do the multiplication. If it's evens, you might be able to do the 35 and the 35 and 15 for the odds, or the 24 and 48 for the evens. The other thing to remember, sometimes you're not going to be able to make this hand. It's got a really sweet twitch. For a backup option, if you haven't put out your flowers yet, but you have put out those two Kongs of the 4 and 6, or the 2 and 4. No, I'm sorry, not the 2 and 4, the 4 and 6, the 6 and 8, 3 and 5, 5 and 7. What do they all have in common? They're all of two different suits, and they're all two numbers away from one another. So what you can do is turn that into the consecutive run hand number 3, with 3 suits. Just the number in the middle becomes your third Kong. So that's to keep in mind if you're stuck and you can't make your original plan. Somebody puts out all 4 of the number that you need for the product, and you just can't make that uh, pair of single numbers. You could switch it, and you'd still be able to possibly win. It depends how late in the game it is, but at least your hand isn't dead. Okay, so we're going down. The addition hands. Personally, I think they're a little bit boring this year because they're monochrome. That always is a drag. Um, they're calling it lucky sevens because they all add up to 7. It's either 1 and 6, 2 and 5, 3 and 4. And remember, I was talking about how hands can sometimes be a pair and then 3 Kongs. So in this case, the numbers are all Kongs and it's a pair of flowers. So it's all in the same suit, super simple. If you find that you're getting all the 7s in a suit, look at what else you're getting in that suit. Like I said, the 2 and the 5, the 3 and the 4, the 1 and the 6, whichever combination you get, if you've got all those 7s, it might be worth looking into going for that hand. And I think if you guys if Jerry and I'm so sorry, if Jerry and Doris are okay with it, I'm gonna make these available to you, these slides, so that you can go back and look at what I've been putting together, so you can see what your options are for backing up. Okay, so we'll make those slides available to you when the lecture's over. Okay, so I was saying like numbers are all over the card. They really truly are. They're in the year section, they're in the quints, they're in consecutive runs, they're in odds and evens, they're all over the place. Actually, are there any evens? Technically, not really. That's one section where they really don't show up too much, except that 2, 4, 6, 8, the one at the very bottom with the pairs of eights. But the idea that they show up all over the place, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them, but I will tip my hand early and tell you that my favorite like number hand this year is not in the like number section. My very favorite like number hand this year is in the 3, 6, 9 section. But we'll get to that. Obviously, in the year section, it's the third hand down, the one where you can either do 2024 with Kongs of 2s in the other 2 suits, or Kongs of 4s in the other 2 suits. So as you're collecting your tiles during the Charleston, you may find that you're very 4 heavy or you're very 2 heavy. And you were thinking, well, should I go with like numbers in 2s? And then you see, wait, but I do have a soap. So that might be your opportunity to make that hand, is if you've got like numbers, but you've also got the soap in the 2s. That might be a fun one to go for. Instead of just doing like numbers in 2s. But likewise, if you can't get a soap, you can switch it back to the other way. The thing about that hand, again, it's very limited like numbers. It's only 2s or 4s, but still, it is like numbers. That quint hand, I was just talking a little bit earlier about how there's a lot of restrictions on the quints. The only time that there's a quint hand with like numbers is the one where it's a pair and then a quint in 2 different suits. So pair of 3s, quint of 4s in dots and bands, or pair of 7s, quint of 8s. It has to be the same numbers. That's the only time that it's like numbers in quints, though. Okay, and then of course, this is one of the neat ones I was just talking about. This is another unique hand this year. The 4th one down. It's a little bit like the quint I was just talking about, where it's a pair and then a quint of like numbers. Now it's a pair and the Kong of like numbers, and then the preceding single. So it goes single pair Kong, single pair Kong. And again, this is one of those when you're thinking about 14, you have 7 tiles in each suit. One of the hands is 2 plus 5, the other is 1 plus 2 plus 4. So you can sort of think about how those two hands interact. If you have jokers, you would want to go for the quint one. If you can't scare up a joker, go for quints because it's not that hard to get a joker. Between exchanging and picking, it's not that hard to get jokers. But if you can't get jokers, you're never going to make that top quint hand, but you might be able to make that consecutive run 1, 2, 4. So keep that in the back of your head. Okay, so this was the hand I was just talking about, the one with the chow, CR6. Um, this is what I like to talk about is that stealthy quint of flowers that isn't in the quint section, but it still requires 5. Um, People ask me, why is there a quint of flowers not in the quint section? There's 2 reasons. One is that you can naturally make a quint of flowers. It's not technically a quint because it doesn't require, well, not technically in the quint section because it doesn't require a joker, but it does use a quint of flowers. And the other reason I think it's on the card is because otherwise you would know that somebody's going for the quints in the quint section with the flowers. But this is a whole extra hand that you might be playing, and people can't guess what you're playing until you make that second exposure. And the only other exposure you would be making in the consecutive run section would be with the 2 pungs. So that's the like numbers in that section would be 2 like numbered pungs, a quint of flowers, and then that what we were talking about earlier, the chow in the third suit. It's like a chow of 2, 3, 4, and then 2 pungs of 5s in the other 2 suits. So again, like numbers of the 2 pungs. I could go through this list, but as I said, I'm going to have it available to you. You can print it out or you can just look at it, but it will be emailed to you after the lecture. But I want to go down a little bit further. You can see I've listed a whole bunch of other hands that use like numbers. But the one hand that I think people, there's 2 actually. One, the 369, the second hand, I call that one the 3 Musketeers because specifically, it's 369 with a single pair and pung in one suit, and then 2 matching pungs of either 3s, 6s, or 9s to complement it, plus a pair of flowers. But the matching pungs, when they're all in 9s, you've got 3 pungs of 9s. And I call that the 3 Musketeers. It's a really cute hand. That's one of my favorites. And the other one that I love, and I think is going to be super popular, is the 4th one down. It's like numbers and wins. I mean, I'm sorry, dragons. I am really losing it today. I apologize. The like numbers and dragons. So if you're thinking about it, you need kongs of one thing and kongs of the other. So my mnemonic for that is it's the pungs of the numbers. They both have a U in them. Pung number, Kong dragon, because dragons have O and kongs have O. So remember, you're doing a number pung and a dragon kong of the same number, whether it's a 3, 6, or 9, and then it's matching dragon in whichever 2 suits you're using. So I think that's going to be a tremendously popular hand. It's another like numbers hand, but it's also using dragons, and people always enjoy that. There is a dragon hand in the like number section itself. We were just talking about it, the fact that the pairs in that must be the numbers, not the dragons, because there's only one place on the entire card where there are dragon pairs. And where is that? In the singles and pairs section only. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about all sorts of singles, like numbers all over the card. And you can go back to this list later if you want to see the ones that I didn't mention during this lecture, or if you want to ask about one specifically later, that's fine. So going back to the specific like numbers hands, the one I was just talking about is LN2, the one about the pair of number pungs, the pair of numbers and pungs of dragons in 2 suits, and then the Kong of the 3rd suit of numbers. Okay, meanwhile, the first like numbers hand is a super easy hand. It's another of those pungs and Kong hands where you've got 2 pungs, 2 Kongs. That's how you get to 14. But it's the flowers, and the three different suits of the same like number. This is where it's so important to remember what I talked about. There are no pungs of flowers this year, only kongs, pairs, and quints. Therefore, the no, the flowers on this hand must be a kong. We've got a kong of flowers, and then that leaves us 10 tiles to use for the other three suits. The three suits like numbers must be 3, 3, and 4. So that's the way to remember it. It has to be a kong of flowers in that particular hand. So remember, pung, pung, kong, kong, but one of the kongs is the flowers. So that's another super simple hand to make, and it's actually got a parallel hand in the Winds and Dragons section. Same idea, three different suits, and instead of it being like numbers, it's dragons in all three suits. So again, Kong of flowers, and then 10 tiles left, all in dragons, one Kong left, and then two Pungs of dragon. So keep that in mind. It has to be a Kong of flowers. Okay, and then finally, the other like numbers hand is kind of fun because they move news into the like numbers section. Um, it's one of those hands I was talking about how you have a pair and then three units of four. Two of them are kongs, matching kongs of like numbers. And then the fourth unit of four, meld of four, is actually four singles of news. So remember what we do with news. News cannot be called for any single piece except the final mahjong tile. It's considered four singles. So that's a little trickier. It still pays the same as the other two hands, but it is a little trickier because you do need one of each wind. Okay, so going back to that quint restriction that I was talking about, the only actual like numbered quint was the one with a pair and then a quint in two different suits. That's the third one. I want to go back to the top quint hand, which is basically a consecutive run with the pair in the middle and then a matching pair of a finishing pair of flowers. So you get your pair of flowers, two quints with a middle pair. So it's 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9. The pair is always the middle. Remember that you've got all the same suit, two quints with a pair in the middle, and then to complete this, that's only 12. You have to complete it with a pair of flowers. The next one down, this is what I'm talking about, is so fun about this card. You're doing two different suits of quints, but they can't be the same number. They cannot be the same number, which is kind of neat that there's a restriction like that. It's not anything's fair game. It's very specific. That doesn't make it easy. It's a very hard hand to defend, even if somebody puts out four wins and a quint. You know, that's the only hand that's going to have four wins and a quint. But you have no idea what that second suit is or what that second number is. So it's very hard to defend against that particular hand. Um, the final hand is closer to what I consider the junk hands that I've always loved, where you have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. The only restriction on this one is for once they're very specific that the number and the dragon must be different suits. If you look on the card, it says any two suits. It's very explicit. You cannot use the dragon of the same suit as the number. That makes it a little bit harder than usual. You have to think twice when you're amassing your tiles to make this quint hand. And then again, it's only a Kong of dragons, not a quint. So the fact that it's a Kong of dragons, that single exposure, no one will know necessarily that you're going for quints. So that's another tricky thing about that hand. As we see, 4 quint hands this year instead of 3. I'm always happy to have more options, so I like the fact that there are 4 of them. Okay, now getting down to that crazy new hand that we've never seen this pattern before, and I mean never seen this pattern before. I've heard it called a sine wave, you know, like a sound wave kind of thing, and I've heard it called a mustache. My personal favorite is sombrero. What I call it because I say it goes up on either end. It goes down a little bit and then it peaks in the middle. And to me, that brought to mind the sombrero. So, what do we see about this hand that makes it hard this year the fact that especially CR1A on the lower end of the number line, notice that the pairs must be, well, pairs always must be natural, but the pairs this year are 2 and 4. And 2s and 4s are tough this year anyway because of the year hand. So it's a little bit tricky to make that hand. It always is to make, there's always going to be two pairs in that consecutive run meld. But the fact that they're 2s and 4s is just a little harder than usual. Again, in the consecutive run section, it's always in the same suit. It's always one or the other end of the number line. You can't suddenly go, oh, I'm doing 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. No, must be 1 through 5 or 5 through 9. And I've seen some clever people ask in general, well, what about in general? Can I just use a soap as a 0 for consecutive numbers? No, you cannot. Most of us know that, but any new player who tries it, we have to explain to them a soap is only a 0 in the context of the year hand. You can't use it as a 0 for consecutive. Okay, so we know 1 through 5 is a little trickier than 5 through 9. Must have those pairs. If you don't have those pairs, you're going to have to change your hand. And we'll talk a little bit about what your other options might be if you've only made one exposure. Sometimes when you've made 2 exposures, you're tied down. But when you've only made 1 exposure, you still have plenty of options. As we see in the odd section, it's either 1 suit or 3. In the odd section, it's still the same pattern with up on the ends, goes down, then goes very up high in the middle. So the middle being the 5s, always going to have a Kong of 5. But the question is it in 3 suits or 1 suit? When it's in 3 suits, you start with suit A, you end with suit C, and then the 5s are all by themselves. There's only 1 exposure in that suit. That's the only suit. The 5s are the only part of that suit. Okay, so hope you're enjoying that hand. We'll talk about it a little later in terms of a hand that's great to switch to. It's a great hand to switch to from a different hand. So CR6, this is the one I was talking about before that I think is so interesting. I talked about that it's there because the flowers don't really require a joker to be a quint, and therefore that doesn't have to be in the quint section. Talked about the chows being this run of 3 single tiles. It can't be considered a pung. You can't use a joker for any part of a chow. And you can't call it for exposure except for the final mahjong tile. And I said the twin pungs are the 4th number, 2 of the same number in 2 different suits. Okay, and we've been talking about light numbers. Okay, news you can use. I'm switching over to the news section now. I really haven't talked about it very much so far. The only thing I was talking about was that dragon part of the Winds and Dragons section. But I'm going to go back to that hand that we had last year. I really appreciate that they've gotten a little creative with that. The flexibility of the main Pung and Kong news hand, the fact that it can either be the Kongs of north-south or the Kongs of east-west. It's up to you. Once you do it, you got to stick with it. You can't suddenly say, well, I've got Pungs of my north and east, and, you can't do it that way. They have to match their partner. The north has to match the south. The east has to match the west, except for one exception that I'll talk about a little bit below. The one time they don't have to match is that 4th hand down. If you remember last year when we had 4 flowers and then single, 2, 3, 4, 1 north, 2 east, 3 west, 4 south, they modified it a little bit this year. It's only 2 flowers. And so they've added an extra tile to the north and the east. So it's 2 flowers and a pair of norths, Pung of east, Pung of west, Pung of south. This is the only time that north doesn't equal south when they're both in the hand. Obviously, when you put out a Kong of a wind for the quints, you don't need the matching wind. But in this particular time, this is the only asymmetric wind hand. North doesn't equal south. The east are the same as the west, but the north is only a pair, the south is full Kong. As I was saying, I like to give you guys options for what to switch to. If you notice, if you look at the second part of that W4, if you had to, if you weren't able to get all the flowers or north that you needed, but you had some jokers, you could switch it to that top hand with the Kongs of the north and south, and then the Kongs of east and west. Because they're very similar. The only difference is you don't, you're not able to get those two pairs. So the fact that they pay the same is a little surprising. It is harder to make that fourth hand than it is to make the top hand. It's, you can use jokers anywhere in the top hand. Okay. Now these are some strategy things that I just absolutely love. The first one I want to talk about is the singles and pairs hand, number 5. They've never had it this way that I can remember. They've had a singles and pairs consecutive run hand where it's 2 flowers, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or any 5 consecutive numbers with their matching dragon. Or they've had 7 consecutive pairs in a row in the same suit. These are both interesting, but this particular one, I've never seen it with 5 consecutive pairs and then both pairs of opposing dragons. It's pretty neat. And there are several different things you can switch to from it if it's not working out for you. One of the most obvious, depending on where on the number line your 5 consecutive numbers are, is you could switch to the consecutive run, the number 1 hand, the 1, 2, 3, my little sombrero hand. If it's 1 through 5 or 5 through 9, it's an easy one, especially if you do have those pairs of 2s and 4s. You can use jokers to call for any of the others to complete that set. You can make the Kongs and the Kong with jokers, and the 2 and the 4 are the only one that had to be pairs. So that's one thing you can switch to, and I love knowing that that's an option. You can also switch, and this is kind of cool. If you've got one of the dragons working and the other isn't working out, you weren't able to get the soap. Say you were doing in BAMs, and then you had your red dragons, but you were not able to get soaps, so you can't make that hand. But you've got some red dragons and you've got some consecutive numbers in BAMs. You could go for CR2, which is a kind of neat hand that is really easy to switch to from this because it's 4 consecutive numbers. It uses 2 pairs and 2 pungs. So if you've already got those 4 pairs, your goal, you just pick whichever part of the number line works for you, where you've got pairs on either end, then the pungs, and then with jokers, you can make your dragons into either color of complementary dragons you can turn into the Kong. So keep that one in mind. It's a nice hand to fall back on. And then, of course, the most obvious thing that you could switch it to, especially if you started picking up jokers, is CR 3, 4, 5, 6, CR 7.1, which is 4 consecutive numbers in the same suit. So 3, 4, 5, 6, or 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever it is, 4 numbers, 2 pungs, and 2 kongs, all consecutive numbers in the same suit. So that's another thing. I love that there's so many things you can switch to from that, including, like I said, that sort of secret one, the second one down in consecutive runs with the complementary dragon. So what the heck, when you're starting out, if you happen to be collecting tiles, making a consecutive run, and you see a couple dragons, you might want to go for it, especially if you don't have any jokers right away. It might be a fun hand to go for. Okay, and then the other hand I want to talk about, of course, is what we used to call the big hand. And this is still the big payoff, but it's not hard this year. I know some of you have been playing. Hopefully all of you have been playing. Probably most of you have been playing online, if not in person. So if you've been playing, you've probably tried to and possibly made this hand already. As I said, it's easier because you're only trying to make 2 of the year melts. You don't need 3 soaps. You don't need 2s and 4s in all 3 suits. The only thing that's tricky about it is making sure you have those wins. And again, it's very similar to the 4th hand in the year section. They sort of complement each other, so if you had to switch back to it, you could. The big difference is whether or not you have jokers, and whether or not you can get that second soap in that and the second suit. So if you're having trouble getting a second soap and you do happen to have jokers, it might be good to switch over to the concealed hand in the year section. But let's say you are seriously going for it, the big hand, it is attainable. The fact that it doesn't even use flowers is good. I mean, flowers, everybody wants them, especially with quints this year. It's a little bit harder to get them. So the fact that the big hand doesn't even require flowers, in general, I feel like it's a much easier get than in previous years. Especially, I think the hardest year was 2022 because you really needed all of the twos naturally. You needed three natural twos in all three suits, and that wasn't fun. But this year, uh, I will be curious if people want to get in touch with me and say, I've made it 6 times this year, I've made it 10 times. I just expect to hear people say they've made it more frequently than usual because I think it's easier. So that's my 2 cents on that one. As ever, I like to give out my email address. If you ever have a question, you can always email me. I'm not the league, but sometimes I'm faster than the league. The other thing, my blog is currently on a platform that is terrible. I can't get a subscription list going. I'm trying to figure out how to switch over to Substack. But until I do that, the best way to find my blog is to just Google the words Booby's Mahjong blog. And there are tons of articles. There's articles about this year's new card. There's articles about strategy, history, all sorts of different things. Even if you read an article from a previous year, there's still important pointers on there, even if they're not relevant to this year's card per se. There are still lessons to be learned about how to play defensively, how to switch your hand, which is, of course, the number one thing when I'm teaching more advanced players. That is the number one thing, is finding a backup hand and learning how to switch and when to switch. So those are all things that you can find out if you go to my blog page, and it's absolutely free. I hope this has been useful to you. I am going to make the slides available, as I said, and I'm going to open this up to questions. Let me just unshare the screen so that we get back to human beings again. And let me know. If somebody in the room wants to moderate the room, but also let's check the comments page and see if anybody's made any. Doesn't look like it. Doesn't look like there's been a lot of questions on the chat yet. So,
I can do that because you don't see it the same way. Yeah, I don't even know how I did that. I don't know what they said up here. But what did she said?
hello. Did anybody have a question? Oh, Sarah does.
I'll ask a question on here.
Thank you, Sarah.
Hi,
Go
Karen.
ahead. Hi.
Sarah Linden here in Long Beach. This is awesome. It's so helpful to look through. I've been having to jump in and out. So I love when you tell us about what hands to switch to. Do you have like the top two you like would go for and then switch to?
For every single hand?
Oh, not for every, just in like you tend to gravitate towards the 2, 4, 6, 8, or yeah, like you tend to gravitate towards for 2, 4, 6, 8, and you would do this hand first, but this makes a good
right.
back.
Exactly. I write articles like that. I don't have it off the top of my head, but if you look through my articles, you will find the best backups for certain things, for sure. And obviously, we know that each singles and pairs hand is basically like a condensed version of a section of the card. So if you start going for a singles and pairs hand X and it's not panning out, you switch to that section of the card. Yeah. What I was trying to say with the like numbers section is the fact that like numbers are all over the card.
Yeah, that's
so
interesting.
If you find, like I said, the one I love in the 369 section with the like numbers and the matching dragons, it's either 3, 6, or 9, and then the matching dragons. You could have started out thinking that you were going for the like number section 2, but you haven't made any exposures yet, and you find that somebody has already exposed all the like numbers of, say you were going in 6s, and somebody's already put out a Kong of 6s, so there's no way you're going to be able to make that hand. But you could switch to that 3, 6, 9 like numbers with the dragons. So for instance, it's those sorts of things. All the like numbers hands, it's good to know where on the card they are. and that you have other options for them. You can switch to the like number section. That top one is a super easy default because
Yeah.
it's all pungs and kongs. It's flowers. So that's certainly one of the best default hands. That one, any pung and kong hand is a good default because you can always use jokers for any part of it.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Sure. Very quiet in that room. Nobody had questions.
There's a question in the chat, I see.
Okay.
You have to do the pairs.
Let me see.
Do you have to do pairs of 8 and 2, 4, 6, 8 concealed hand?
Yes, it must be pairs of 8. In the number sections, the odds and evens, they're very explicit. The only really flexibles are in the consecutive runs when it says these numbers only. Yes, it has to be those numbers. But in general, in the consecutive run section, it can be anywhere on the number line. Like numbers can be anywhere on the number line, but and most of the quints can be anywhere on the number line. The ones that are explicitly must be exactly as written are 2, 4, 6, 8 and 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. It's got to be, unless it says either 5, 7, or 9. You have some flexibility, but in general, it must be on that particular hand. It must be pairs of 8s, and then the 2, 4, 6 with the pungs, the 2 and the 6 with a pair of 4s. So that's a really interesting hand. Excuse me, it's 4 pairs and 2 punks. I'm gonna go get a drink. I'll be right back. I intentionally meant to put that right next to my table, and then I neglected to do that. You try talking for 50 minutes without getting a dry throat. Okay. Anybody? No other questions, really? I am curious. What?
You have a
Nope.
website or Facebook, Instagram page. You already showed us the blog.
Oh, that I don't have I don't do Insta. I have a Facebook page. I'm almost 60. I'm not as up to things. I'm not as tech savvy as some people. So the fact that I have a Facebook page is kind of my limit. And that's part of why I'm switching to Substack, because I literally do not know how to do a mailing list. And Substack will do that for me. But I do have a Facebook page if you still subscribe to Facebook. If you do the searching for Booby Fisher, look for searching for Booby Fisher. There is a page that has all of my articles are linked to that, and sometimes I'll just post something Maj related. I might talk about an upcoming lecture. I might be just talking about something in social, in the media. I saw a TV show that showed people playing Mahjong. But every time I write an article, I also put a link to that article on my Facebook page. So if you go to searching for Booby Fisher and either follow it or, I don't know, join it, whatever, there's a way to, I think if you even like it, you start to get it on your feed. So if you're a Facebook person, it's called, it's named after my first book, Searching for Booby, B-U-B-B-E, and then Fisher, don't forget it's Fisher with a C.
You just Google your name and it's easy to find your blog.
Oh,
Well, Fern Bernstein interviewed you, and that's on there, I think, too.
yes. I do Friends show every year. Sometimes I do 2 or 3 of them, but every year I always do the new card lecture. And those of you that follow Fern, I think she's very public about the fact that she's coping with cancer, and we're all hoping that she pulls through. She's had a pretty rough time with it lately. So,
She spoke
yes, Fern.
years ago.
Hmm?
She was here a number of years ago when her book came out, Mahjong Mondays.
Yes,
Yeah.
she's a
Karen,
doll.
I have a question. When
Mhm.
when you turn your tiles over and you have no pairs and nothing that just odd numbers, what do you do? What's your procedure?
That's a really good question. So there's not even like 6 of them are even and 2 of them are odd. There's like literally nothing that they have in common. I mean, that's what I do. The first thing I do is say, which suit is the strongest. And if no suit is the strongest, then I say, okay, which part of the number line is the strongest? 1 through 4, 3 through 7, 5 through 9. I just sort of try and see whether I could make a consecutive run out of it. Or I look, how are we doing for evens or odds? Or how are we doing for 3, 6, 9? There's got to be something that's a little stronger than anything else. Usually it's the number line. If it's really nothing else, I'll say, well, at least I've got a whole bunch of things clustered in the 6 through 9 section. So there's got to be some starting point. And the other thing, of course, is winds and dragons. So keep an eye out for those. You might have 2 or 3 winds. And if really nothing else makes any sense, hold on to the winds. Hopefully people will be passing those. And definitely pay attention during the first Charleston. Because if you notice that everybody's passing you evens, keep the evens and hopefully some more will come around. There must be something to start with. Sometimes it's harder than others. And if you've ever heard my other lectures, we are all, if we're equally matched over time, we're expecting to win about 20% of the games. There will be some wall games, but over time with evenly matched players, you should only expect to win about 20% of the time. It's just the natural way things are going to fall out. So there will be hands that are a nightmare. There will be absolutely crummy deals, and you just got to endure it and go on to the next game. And another thing to remember is we get about 2/3, on average, 2/3 of a joker and 2/3 of a flower in each deal. So if you're not getting jokers, one of the next deals, you'll probably get 2 or 3 of them, because on average, it's going to fall out that you get, throughout the entire day, you're going to get 2/3 of one. So if you haven't been getting jokers, your time will come. There will come some beautiful hands for you. And really, if you're not winning that much, it's okay. There will be better weeks for you. You just do the best you can with what you're dealt.